Every relationship begins with the illusion that love alone will be enough. Two hearts, one dream, one direction, until the first silence arrives. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of confusion. The moment when both pray, but hear different things. When one says, "I feel God leading us this way," and the other whispers, "But I don't." That's where faith inside a relationship is truly tested, not in passion, but in perception. The hardest part of love isn't disagreement, it's dissonance. Here it's when you both love God, both want what's right, yet your spirits seem tuned to different frequencies. It's the ache of trying to hear heaven while your emotions are still too loud. Andrew Huberman once said the brain seeks patterns in noise, but when you love someone, you're also trying to decode the heartbeat behind their words. That's why hearing God as a couple isn't a matter of religion, it's a matter of alignment. Spiritual hearing requires more than closed eyes and quiet rooms. It demands the death of ego, the humility to say, maybe the voice of God sounds different through them. It's learning that sometimes the answer isn't revealed to one person, but hidden in the space between two hearts that choose to listen. That space, raw, uncertain, and holy, is where divine clarity begins to echo. Descartes said that doubt is the beginning of wisdom, and perhaps that's true in love as well. Because it's often in questioning, not certainty, that couples find truth. God doesn't shout through chaos, He speaks through unity. Not identical thoughts, but harmonized trust. And when both hearts quiet long enough to let His rhythm emerge, something miraculous happens. The argument turns into revelation, the distance becomes dialogue, and two different minds begin to hear one shared voice. This isn't a story about perfection. It's about process. How two people can move from noise to knowing, from tension to testimony. Because when a couple learns to hear God together, decisions no longer divide, they direct. The noise between two hearts. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, it comes from distance. It's the silence that sits between two people who once shared everything, but now find themselves unable to share the same stillness. You know that silence. It doesn't shout, it doesn't accuse, but it weighs. You can feel it when you walk past each other in the kitchen, when you pray together but the words don't land the same, when you say, "I'm fine," knowing neither of you believes it. That's the noise between two hearts, invisible, heavy, alive. It isn't born from anger, it's born from exhaustion, from too many conversations that went nowhere, from too many prayers that felt unanswered, from the quiet ache of trying to love someone and God at the same time, but feeling like you're failing both. And yet, that's where every couple eventually finds themselves, standing in a kind of emotional fog, still loving, still trying, but no longer hearing clearly. The problem isn't that God stopped speaking, it's that life became louder than His voice. Neuroscience calls this state emotional dissonance, when your brain is flooded with so many mixed signals that it can't interpret what's real anymore. It's the same reason people can sit side by side and still feel miles apart. Andrew Huberman would explain that your nervous system can't fully rest if it's waiting for emotional safety that never comes. The human mind begins to filter every word through self-protection. You start listening, not to understand, but to survive. And once that happens, no matter how kind the words are, they sound distorted. That's how the static starts. Spiritually, that static is what drowns out the divine frequency. God never stops speaking, but His tone gets lost under the weight of fear, pride, and the echo of past arguments that still live in memory. Descartes once wrote that truth reveals itself only to the mind that first suspends judgment. In love, that means you cannot hear heaven while rehearsing your defense. The more you try to be understood, the less you truly listen. Every couple faces that crossroad, the moment you realize you've been praying for God to fix the other person instead of asking Him to soften your own heart. That's where healing begins. Because when the noise between you becomes unbearable, that's not the end. It's the invitation. The noise is the symptom that your hearts are trying to recalibrate. It's the universe whispering that it's time to pause, not to quit. You may think distance is a sign that love is fading, but often it's the way grace makes space for clarity. Silence can be violent, yes, but it can also be holy. Because when everything you've built starts to sound unclear, heaven steps in with one question. Are you willing to stop speaking long enough to hear me again? It's not a command to be still. It's a rescue from the noise that never belonged to you in the first place. The truth is, God doesn't shout over chaos. He waits for it to quiet. The moment both hearts stop performing, stop defending, and stop expecting the other to change first, the frequency shifts. The static begins to thin. You start to feel again instead of react. You remember the warmth in their voice, the peace in their presence. You remember that love was never about perfect communication. It was about shared surrender. So if you're standing in that silence tonight, wondering why your prayers feel hollow and your conversations feel shallow, know this. You're not broken, you're being tuned. Sometimes, before harmony can return, dissonance must expose everything that's out of rhythm. God is not punishing you with confusion. He's resetting your hearing. The noise between two hearts is not the sound of an ending. It's the sound of heaven preparing you both to listen again, not to win, but to understand. When love and ego sound alike, every relationship begins with the illusion that love always tells the truth. But time has a way of revealing how easily the human heart can disguise pride as passion, fear as faith, and control as conviction. It's one of the greatest deceptions in spiritual life, when ego starts using God's language. You think you're following divine guidance, but you're really just protecting your comfort. You feel a surge of confidence and call it revelation, yet sometimes what feels like the voice of God is only the echo of your own desire. Andrew Huberman would describe this as a neurological bias, the mind's habit of confirming what it already wants to believe. When we're emotionally invested in an outcome, the brain releases dopamine in anticipation of being right, and that chemical high feels like certainty. Spiritually, it feels like divine assurance. You say, God told me, but what you mean is, I've convinced myself. It's not deceit, it's human. The ego doesn't appear as arrogance, it appears as clarity. That's what makes it so dangerous. Judith Beck's work in cognitive therapy reveals that our thoughts often wear masks to preserve our self-image. We construct inner narratives to justify choices we already made emotionally. In relationships, this looks like using spiritual language to defend emotional decisions. I feel peace about this, you say, when in truth you feel relief that you won't have to compromise. God showed me this, you insist, when in reality your fear of being wrong won't let you slow down long enough to test it. The ego doesn't hate God, it imitates him. Descartes said that clear thinking requires doubt, not to destroy belief, but to purify it. In love, doubt becomes humility. It's the willingness to hold your conviction under light and ask, is this God or is this me? That question is the scalpel that separates divine guidance from human emotion. It's not a sign of weak faith, it's the discipline of mature faith. Because if you can't question what you believe, you'll mistake every impulse for revelation. In a relationship, this confusion can quietly erode intimacy. One partner claims to hear God's direction, the other feels unheard, unseen and silenced by the supposed authority of spiritual certainty. What begins as sincerity becomes manipulation, not out of malice, but blindness. Love's greatest enemy is not sin, it's self-deception. When one heart refuses to listen, both stop hearing. But when love and ego start to sound alike, there's still hope, because the same silence that exposes pride also invites truth. The Holy Spirit doesn't compete with our inner noise. He waits for exhaustion to make space for honesty. And when exhaustion finally humbles you, you begin to notice the difference between peace and pride. Peace is quiet, pride is restless. Peace leads to patience, pride demands immediacy. Peace invites partnership, pride isolates. Hearing God as a couple begins with this shared humility, the choice to pause when everything in you wants to prove your point. It's the decision to value clarity over being right, to trust that revelation confirmed in unity is worth waiting for. When you both learn to test your convictions against love, pride loses its disguise. Love without humility is just noise, but love that dares to question its own certainty becomes wisdom. It becomes the kind of faith that doesn't speak for God, but listens with Him. And in that posture, you start to rediscover what it means to hear, not to dominate, not to win, but to discern together what is truly divine. The language of divine alignment. When two hearts seek to hear God together, something profound happens. Communication stops being about words and starts becoming about rhythm. Divine alignment isn't found in what you say. It's revealed in how you move together when words fall short. You felt it before. Those moments when silence feels sacred, when simply sitting beside each other feels like prayer. That is what it means to align spiritually. Not to think the same, but to sense the same. It's when peace, not logic, becomes the language you both understand. Neuroscience calls this phenomenon neural synchrony, the alignment of two minds when they share focused stillness. Andrew Huberman describes it as a biological harmony, where heart rate, breathing, and even eye movement begin to mirror one another. In that state, the body confirms what the soul already knows. Unity creates clarity. It's not mystical, it's measurable. When you pray or reflect together, your nervous systems stabilize, your bodies release tension, and your capacity to listen, to God and to each other, expands. The divine uses that calm as its microphone. But alignment is not uniformity. You were never meant to erase difference in the name of unity. Descartes believed that truth reveals itself through distinction, one clear thought standing apart from confusion. Spiritually, that means divine unity doesn't make you identical, it makes your individuality functional. Your strengths begin to balance the other's weaknesses. Your silence begins to fill their noise. That's why couples who truly align don't compete. They complement. Judith Beck might call this cognitive synergy, when two minds move from reaction to reflection, choosing cooperation over control. It's a psychological reflection of a spiritual truth. Revelation flows where defensiveness ends. When you stop listening to answer and start listening to align, you create sacred space. And that space becomes the meeting point between the human and the divine. You see, God doesn't just speak to individuals, He speaks through relationships. He designed them as amplifiers for His presence. When a couple learns to pray in the same rhythm, to breathe in peace before decisions, they start tuning into what can't be heard through words, that soft internal yes that both feel before either speaks. It's not telepathy, it's trust. The Spirit doesn't need to shout because He now has two quiet hearts forming one echo. The beauty of divine alignment is that it doesn't always require agreement. It only requires honesty and humility. You don't have to see the same thing. You just have to seek the same source. Over time, differences stop threatening connection. They start sharpening discernment. The friction that once sparked conflict now creates clarity. The two minds, once arguing from fear, begin to move like instruments tuned to the same frequency. Different notes, one melody. And that's the secret no one teaches about hearing God together. It's less about prayer and more about posture. When both hearts bow in the same direction, even without speaking, heaven recognizes harmony. That's divine alignment, not a miracle of emotion, but a discipline of peace. It's when God's voice no longer has to choose between you because He's finally speaking through you both. The third voice in the room. Every lasting relationship lives in the tension between two voices, yours and your partner's. But the real transformation begins when both become quiet enough for a third voice to enter. That's the divine presence, the whisper that doesn't compete, doesn't command, but completes. It's the sound that hovers between you when words fall apart, and yet somehow peace arrives. You can't see it, but you can feel it. That subtle sense that something greater is listening, mediating, guiding. This third voice doesn't raise its tone to overrule either of you. It simply waits until you're done defending yourselves. It's not found in the louder prayer, the stronger argument, or the one who quotes more scripture. It speaks through humility, through the shared breath that happens when both finally exhale the need to win. And when it speaks, you recognize it not by volume, but by stillness. Everything inside you stops fighting. Everything makes quiet sense. Andrew Huberman would call this a neurobiological shift. When both partners calm their nervous systems through co-regulation, synchronized breathing, softened tones, relaxed posture, the brain interprets safety. The amygdala, which governs threat detection, deactivates, allowing the prefrontal cortex, the seat of empathy, reasoning, and wisdom, to engage. Spiritually, this is exactly how the third voice makes itself heard. Peace is its evidence. You don't just think differently, you feel differently. The divine uses calm as confirmation. Descartes once wrote that clarity is proof of truth. The third voice carries that kind of clarity, not the logical kind, but the kind that makes chaos irrelevant. It doesn't explain itself, it simply aligns both hearts around what's real. You realize that God's role in your relationship was never to pick sides, it was to create sight. His truth is not a verdict but a revelation, a reminder that love was always meant to be a collaboration between heaven and earth. Judith Beck's work helps us see how this process unfolds psychologically. She would describe it as metacognitive distance, stepping outside your own thought long enough to see from another perspective. When two people enter that shared space, they stop talking at each other and start listening through each other. The relationship becomes a mirror where God speaks not to individuals, but between them. That's why the third voice often arrives disguised as agreement, as an unspoken peace that both recognize without needing proof. In that moment, the air feels lighter. It's as though heaven has stepped closer, not to interfere, but to interpret. You both realize the argument wasn't about who was right, but about who was ready to listen. And the instant you let go of needing to control the outcome, the third voice emerges like light finding its way through a crack. The mystery is that the third voice has always been in the room. You didn't summon it. You simply created the silence for it to surface. It's the same voice that spoke creation into existence, gentle, deliberate, unwavering. When two hearts align in humility, that voice becomes not an interruption, but a continuation of your love story. You stop hearing you versus me and start hearing us with God. That's the sound of heaven joining the conversation, turning what once felt divided into something deeply whole. The sacred pause before decisions. There's a sacred space between knowing what to do and doing it. A fragile, silent pause where most people panic and only a few find peace. That space is the crucible of divine wisdom, and it's often the most uncomfortable part of faith. In relationships, that pause can feel unbearable. You've prayed, you've talked, you've analyzed every possible outcome, and yet heaven seems quiet. It's in that stillness that the true test of unity begins, not in agreement, but in waiting. Most couples think the goal is to decide. God's goal is to align. He's not trying to give you an answer first, he's trying to build you into the kind of hearts that can handle one. The sacred pause before a decision is where your motives surface, your fears expose themselves, and your trust either deepens or collapses. It's where you discover whether you truly want God's will or simply want His approval for what you already planned. Andrew Huberman's neuroscience explains that when you act impulsively under stress, your brain bypasses the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for insight, foresight, and moral reasoning, and defers to instinct. That's why urgency and wisdom rarely coexist. The sacred pause, on the other hand, allows cortisol to drop and clarity to rise. The longer you rest in patience, the more your brain stabilizes into coherent processing, allowing you to perceive what emotion once distorted. Spiritually, the same pattern applies. God doesn't rush revelation because revelation given too early becomes noise. Judith Beck might call this cognitive deceleration, the discipline of slowing thought so that truth can catch up. In a relationship, that means resisting the urge to fix it now. Every time you pause, you're training your nervous system and your soul to trust process over panic. The pause is not empty, it's pregnant with direction. Heaven works in silence because silence disarms control. When you no longer demand an immediate answer, you make room for an accurate one. Descartes said that clear thinking requires suspending judgment. Spiritually, this means the pause before a decision is not avoidance, it's reverence. It's the act of acknowledging that your understanding is finite and that divine timing operates beyond emotion. The pause is where love matures, because to wait together is to prove that peace matters more than pride, Many couples mistake God's silence for absence when it's actually preparation. If you rush ahead of His timing, you'll drag anxiety into places meant for peace. If you linger long enough, though, you'll begin to sense alignment forming quietly underneath. The heart rate slows, voices soften, and what was once confusion begins to feel less like delay and more like orchestration. The sacred pause teaches you that discernment is not a download, it's a dialogue. Heaven isn't withholding, it's refining. You don't receive the answer until your motives are as pure as your desire for truth. And when that purification happens, the decision becomes obvious. It's not forced, not debated, it simply fits. So if you're standing in that uncertain in-between, don't despise it. This is holy ground disguised as hesitation. The pause before your decision isn't a void, it's a visitation. It's where love learns to breathe and faith learns to listen. Because in the rhythm of divine communication, silence isn't God's delay, it's His signature, the mirror of mutual surrender. There's a kind of strength that only appears when both hearts let go at the same time, not in defeat, but in surrender. It's when you stop trying to convince, defend, or correct, and instead open your hands before God and say, "We're listening." That moment is not weakness, it's the highest form of spiritual intelligence, because only empty hands can receive direction. Judith Beck would describe this as cognitive cooperation, the psychological space where two minds release control and meet in shared vulnerability. It's no longer about who's right, it's about what's real. Descartes might call this a return to clarity, stripping away assumptions until only truth remains. In love, this means seeing your partner not as opposition, but as reflection. The same humility you want from them is the one God is asking from you. Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence teaches that empathy is not agreement, but awareness. When you feel what the other feels without trying to fix it, understanding blooms. That's what happens in mutual surrender. Empathy becomes a doorway for divine wisdom. The moment both hearts soften, the voice of God no longer has to shout. Andrew Huberman's neuroscience offers the physiological counterpart. When couples reach this calm, their heart rhythms literally begin to synchronize. Their bodies confirm what their spirits already know. Alignment is happening. That's why surrender feels peaceful even before answers arrive. The nervous system recognizes truth before the mind does. In this mirror, you realize something profound. Surrender is not losing individuality, it's discovering unity. The goal was never to think the same, but to move in the same direction. And when both souls bow in the same posture of humility, heaven speaks through their silence. When one hears and the other doesn't. Few things test love like spiritual imbalance. One partner feels clarity, certain they've heard God, while the other remains silent, uncertain, or even skeptical. It's not rebellion, it's rhythm. Revelation doesn't always reach both hearts at the same time. And in that delay, tension grows. One feels unseen, the other feels pressured. This is the quiet struggle of faith between two believers who love each other but can't seem to hear heaven in unison. Andrew Huberman would explain that when the brain encounters uncertainty, it defaults to protection. One partner pushes for resolution, the other retreats into reflection. The nervous system interprets difference as danger. But God often uses this gap to purify motives, not to divide, but to develop trust. The one who knows must learn humility, and the one who waits must learn patience. Both are being refined by silence. Descartes might call this an epistemic test. Can you trust what you cannot yet verify? Spiritually, it's a question of surrendering not just to God's will, but to His timing. Love means allowing revelation to mature in your partner without forcing it. Judith Beck would frame it as decentering, stepping outside your perception long enough to understand theirs. It's no longer about proving what you heard, it's about protecting connection while clarity unfolds. In divine relationships, imbalance is not punishment, it's preparation. When one hears first, it's not a crown. It's a calling to carry the other in grace. Because revelation given to one is never meant to elevate, only to illuminate. The moment both stop competing for who's right and start supporting each other's process, alignment begins to form quietly beneath the surface. Hearing God together sometimes starts with accepting that for now, one listens while the other learns to trust. And that trust, more than any voice, is what heaven honors most. The still small voice in conflict. Conflict is the forge where both love and faith are tested. It's not the argument itself that breaks a couple. It's the inability to find meaning inside the noise. Most people expect to hear God in peace, yet he often speaks clearest in tension, not through calm but through conviction. The still small voice doesn't silence conflict, it reframes it. It asks, what truth is trying to emerge beneath your reaction? Judith Beck would explain that every argument is built on core beliefs, stories we tell ourselves about safety, worth, and control. When those stories collide, the surface issue isn't what you're truly fighting about. Beneath "you never listen" is "I don't feel seen." Beneath "you always decide alone" is "I'm afraid I don't matter." Cognitive awareness exposes this pattern, but only humility heals it. Spiritually, that humility opens the ear to the divine frequency buried under human emotion. Andrew Huberman's research mirrors this. During conflict, adrenaline and cortisol flood the body, narrowing perception and fueling defensiveness. But when one partner consciously lowers their tone, breathes slowly or softens their gaze, it rewires the other's brain toward safety. That's when the still small voice can finally be heard, not outside, but within. The Holy Spirit often sounds like your own conscience once the noise fades. Descartes taught that truth survives examination, and the same applies here. If you bring your argument into light through prayer, reflection, or silence, what's not from God will collapse, and what is will remain. The conflict becomes revelation, a refining fire that burns away pride and exposes purity. Because sometimes the voice of God in your relationship isn't a booming answer. It's the quiet moment when both realize we don't want to win anymore. We just want to understand. That's the miracle. Hearing God not above the conflict but inside it. The science of peaceful agreement. Peace is not the absence of disagreement. It's the state of nervous systems that have learned to stay regulated while truth is being discovered. Real unity between two people doesn't mean they see everything the same way. It means they can stay emotionally steady enough for revelation to arrive. Andrew Huberman's neuroscience confirms this. When both partners reach physiological calm, their prefrontal cortices synchronize, allowing logic, empathy, and intuition to operate simultaneously. In that balance, wisdom becomes accessible. Spiritually, this is what Scripture calls the peace that surpasses understanding. It's not passive, it's profoundly intelligent. It's the kind of peace that can guide decisions without explanation. The kind that whispers, "You'll know when it's right because it won't feel forced." That feeling isn't imaginary. It's the brain recognizing coherence, the body confirming that spirit and mind are finally aligned. Judith Beck would frame this as cognitive integration, when emotion and reason merge instead of compete. In relationships, it's the point where listening becomes more important than convincing. Descartes sought certainty through thought. Faith finds it through peace. You may not understand the entire plan, but you can sense divine rhythm, and that's enough. When couples learn to measure clarity not by agreement but by peace, decision-making transforms. The question shifts from "are we on the same page" to "are we at peace about this?" Because peace doesn't lie. The moment both hearts feel it simultaneously, you've found your answer, not logically but spiritually, biologically, and relationally. This is the mystery of hearing God together. When your souls stop competing for control, they start resonating in truth. The peace that follows is not coincidence, it's confirmation, the weight of shared vision. When a couple finally hears God together, the revelation doesn't end in emotion. It begins in responsibility. Vision is not romance, it's stewardship. Once you've seen where God is leading, you must now carry it together. The beauty of shared hearing is unity. The challenge of shared vision is discipline. You realize that divine direction is never given for comfort, but for calling. Andrew Huberman's findings on motivation explain this dynamic perfectly. The brain releases dopamine not only when we achieve something, but when we move toward a purpose that feels meaningful. In a spiritual relationship, that purpose becomes multiplied. Two nervous systems, two minds, one direction. That synchronization of drive and focus gives a couple resilience when challenges come. Neuroscience calls it co-regulated purpose. Faith calls it covenant. Descartes believed knowledge implied responsibility. Once you know truth, you're accountable to act. The same is true here. Hearing God as a couple means your decisions now carry eternal weight. Every step taken in unity has exponential impact because divine intention multiplies through agreement. Judith Beck might frame this as behavioral activation, turning insight into structured action. Spiritually, it's obedience in motion, but the weight of vision can also reveal the strength of your foundation. When both feel tired, it's easy to confuse divine testing with divine abandonment, yet true vision refines more than it rewards. It asks both partners to walk by faith when the light grows dim, trusting that if the calling came through unity, the provision will too. Shared vision is holy ground. It demands humility, patience, and endurance. You're not walking your plan anymore, you're walking God's. And the more aligned you remain, the more your steps echo His rhythm. That's why peace follows purpose like a shadow, because heaven always supports what it births. When God says, wait, instead of yes, every couple who prays for direction eventually meets the silence that feels like contradiction. You expected a door to open. Instead, nothing moves. That's when faith becomes uncomfortable, because waiting feels like rejection when you don't yet understand that delay is its own answer. When God says wait, He's not denying your prayer. He's developing your capacity to carry what you asked for. Judith Beck might describe this as delayed reinforcement. The mind struggled to accept that fulfillment postponed is not fulfillment denied. The emotional brain wants resolution, but the spiritual mind knows growth requires gestation. Andrew Huberman's research mirrors this beautifully. Anticipation activates the same neural pathways as achievement, meaning faith literally trains the brain to sustain hope under uncertainty. The couple who learns to wait together trains not just their hearts but their biology to trust divine timing. Descartes taught that patience is a discipline of reason, the ability to think beyond impulse. In relationships, patience is love's highest intelligence. It means choosing peace even when clarity hides. During this phase, God doesn't reveal answers through outcomes, but through endurance. You begin to see how waiting exposes everything: your motives, your fears, your level of surrender. When one partner grows restless and the other remains calm, you learn balance. When both grow restless and still choose prayer over panic, you learn maturity. The delay becomes the classroom where unity is tested and faith becomes visible, and then quietly, you notice something. Waiting has transformed you. You no longer pray for doors, you pray for discernment. You no longer beg for answers. You become the kind of couple God can trust with them. Because wait was never punishment. It was the preparation that made yes sustainable, building a rhythm of revelation. Hearing God as a couple isn't meant to happen only in crisis. It's meant to become a rhythm, a living habit woven into daily life. Revelation loses power when treated like a rare event. But when it becomes rhythm, it turns direction into lifestyle. The same way breath anchors the body, shared listening anchors the relationship. It's how two hearts remain in sync long after the storm has passed. Andrew Huberman's neuroscience shows that consistent repetition builds neural entrainment, the alignment of biological rhythms through routine. When couples pray, reflect, or even sit in silence together regularly, their emotional circuits begin to harmonize. Over time, peace becomes muscle memory. You no longer force clarity, you flow into it. Spiritually, that's what Paul meant when he said to pray without ceasing. Not endless words, but continuous awareness. Judith Beck would describe this as cognitive maintenance, reinforcing truth so that it becomes automatic under stress. In relationships, this means no longer waiting for conflict to reconnect with faith. You build habits that keep you near God and near each other before chaos arrives. A nightly prayer, a morning reflection, even a quiet moment holding hands without speaking, all become channels where divine insight naturally flows. Descartes might call this ordered reflection, a disciplined habit of clarity. In practice, It's the sacred consistency that prevents disconnection from breeding confusion, because when revelation becomes rhythm, decisions become lighter. You stop chasing signs and start cultivating sensitivity. This rhythm of revelation is what keeps love anchored in wisdom and faith anchored in intimacy. You don't wait for God to interrupt your life. You invite Him into your routine. And in that constancy, your relationship transforms from reactive to prophetic, a daily dialogue between two hearts and heaven. One voice, one decision, one peace. There comes a moment when the prayer stops being two voices reaching upward and becomes one voice echoing in harmony. It's not that you start thinking identically, it's that you start discerning collectively. You both feel it before you say it, the quiet certainty that this is right, this is the path, this is peace. That moment isn't magic, it's maturity. It's the proof that you've learned how to hear God together. Andrew Huberman's studies on neural synchrony describe what happens when two people focus on the same intention. Their brain waves begin to align. Spiritually, that alignment becomes revelation. You don't need thunder or signs. You recognize divine order in the calm that settles between you. Peace becomes the language of confirmation. It's not excitement or relief. It's stillness that feels intelligent. Judith Beck would say you've reached cognitive integration. Your thoughts, emotions, and values are working in unity. In faith, it's deeper than psychology. It's covenant. Two distinct minds tuned to the same divine frequency. Descartes might call it clarity without conflict, perception purified of bias. The Stoics would call it ataraxia, the calm that comes when reason and spirit finally agree. This is the fruit of everything you've walked through, the noise, the waiting, the surrender. You no longer ask, is this my voice or yours? Because both have learned to echo the same truth. You've discovered that divine guidance doesn't divide, it harmonizes. And as you stand there side by side, decision made and peace undeniable, you realize that hearing God together was never about sound, it was about transformation. The miracle isn't that heaven finally spoke, it's that your hearts finally learned how to listen as one.